I guess while we wait for people, what kind of topics do you all want to hear about or ask about?
Personally, it would be really nice to dig a little bit more into machine learning or deep learning.
Okay.
If possible, so like more like in coding oriented things, if the rest of the group would be amenable to that.
Yeah, hold on.
I don't know how much we can feasibly accomplish in the next, how much over time.
That's a good question. I think so what I'll say is I can talk more about machine learning and deep learning. I can definitely pull back up the notebook and we can talk through some more examples or something. Let's see what other questions people have, because that's a very open-ended kind of, I could spend many hours doing that. So
fair enough. Yeah, I guess like yeah, I'm not sure how feasible it would be to do like any like code along piece in this time. I mean, I feel like it makes more sense to foresee like if there are other quicker conceptual questions, and then if there's time, we can do a little live action stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't have like another demo prepared, but we can just kind of
wing it.
Yeah, wing it. You'll get to see what you know.
There's some appreciation out there.
I wanted also to ask a question about Git, because I tried to rewatch the lesson and I couldn't update the Git from Git, the modification that I did on GitHub. So with the Git pull, it didn't work. So I would like to ask you how to update these changes.
So you made an update on, sorry, the sound was a little bit blurry, so I want to make sure I understood. You made an update on the website, and then when you did Git pull, it didn't come down?
Yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I can think of a couple of reasons that might have happened, and we can kind of go through those. I think we can go ahead and get started. Let's start with that one, because I think that's something we can do pretty quickly. And it's a good thing to review, because you all will be using a lot of Git next week. I promise. So let me share my screen. Oh boy, if I can find the right screen. There we go. Okay. What you were saying is you did something like you went to github.com/Noah Benson, or your username slash for me it was cookbook 2, I think. And you made like a edit to the recipe here.
Yeah.
Now, one possibility, one reason, so real quick question, when you ran git pull, did it seem to work or did it give you an error?
No, it works, but I didn't have the fast forward. Just change it the README file that I changed it somehow, but couldn't really change the guacamole file.
Okay, so you went into guacamole.md here, and you made a change here. So let me just do a change. Well, actually, before I make this change, I'm going to go make sure I have a copy of it checked out here locally as it is. So I'm going to open up my terminal. That's pretty small. Okay. Open up my terminal, and I'm going to git clone git at github.com/Noah Benson /cookbook 2. Okay, and I'm going to go into cookbook 2. And now so now I've got the guacamole.md file like it is. And if I come over here and I make a change, so I don't know what I'm going to change here. Maybe we'll add some tomatoes to our guacamole, and then commit that change. Okay, so now I've made the change. And now I run git pull.
Yeah.
And did it look kind of like this? Like it ran just fine.
Yeah, it looked like this, but it couldn't really change in the fast forward word part. It didn't say guacamole MD1 plus.
So one possibility is that you were on a different branch than the branch you changed online. So if, for example, so here guacamole.md was changed and we can see that in the fast forward, like you say you didn't see. So, but if I'd gone to the new recipe branch, and if I were to make the edit here, I'll add tomatoes again. So a kind of weird thing is that if you come over here, if I get poll, it will fetch the updates, and you notice it says here that there's a new recipe changed to new recipe, but it doesn't say anything about guacamole.md. And if I cat guacamole.md, we'll see the tomatoes here, but this is this was maybe a bad example because this is from the main repository. If I then say get checkout new recipe, we'll also see the tomatoes here because I put it in the new recipe. So real quick, if you have a terminal open with your repository, now I don't remember the command to list the branches, but we're just going to Google it. Git list branches. Git branch-r and git branch-a. Okay, so then if I type git branch-a, we can see main and new recipe, and new recipe here. So go ahead and run that. Do you see another branch aside from origin main?
Yeah, I see the same origin main and new recipe.
And are you on new recipe?
Yeah.
Okay, so try git checkout main. Like that.
Check out main.
And then you should see something about switching branch, and then try to cat your guacamole MD and see if you see the change there.
Oh, it said something like your branch is behind origin main by 6 commits and can be fast forwarded.
It said something about it's able to fast forward.
Yeah. So
So that should be fine. It's different than mine because you were in a different state than my repository.
Okay, yeah.
That's
Now
okay.
we update it and update it.
Okay. Yeah, so this actually illustrates something about Git that we only kind of touched on that's kind of important, which is that when you git pull, it will actually pull all of your branches, any changes that have been made. It syncs the whole repository. And when you switch to branches, it actually updates the file in your directory. So it keeps all that data kind of in the background. And the reason is because recall that I drew this weird little diagram using my trackpad of like commits being updates to a branch and updates to a branch. When you git pull, it downloads all those commits, no matter whether they're useful to your current branch or not, and it just remembers which commit the branch is pointing to. So basically, when you then change your branch, it just checks out the other version of the branch or the other set of commits to the current directory. So basically, I think the lesson here is that git branches, if you're on the wrong branch, it can really conceal the changes you've been doing somewhere else or something. And so always make sure you know what branch you're on. Yeah. But that's a great question.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so and I think a couple people joined us. So we had one request to talk a little more about machine learning and deep learning and maybe do some more programming examples of those. But before we do that, because that's a very big topic or a very extensive topic, I want to ask if there's any other questions people have that we can maybe like quicker questions or other topics people want to hear about. Please let me know.
I have a quick question in regards to, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I have a quick question in regards to the Open Neuro database that you discussed earlier. So you mentioned that we could potentially use it as like a way to store our data if we were to put it into the repository. I was just wondering like how are, I guess like if you have like very sensitive data, like for example, genetics along with the imaging component, are there protections for that? And also, like as an aside, if I were interested in a project like that, would I be able to find all that data from the subjects, or is it just neuroimaging data? Like,
Yes,
are there
that's a-
demographics and everything?
That's a good question. So every data set on Open Neuro is a little different because it's put together by a different research group and different people. And so some research groups really care about things like whether they're left-handed or right-handed. And so they'll put that in their participants.tsv file and make sure everyone knows it. Other groups, like I've never collected handedness data from any subject I've run, because in vision, we just don't really care about your handedness very much. It doesn't have a big effect on anything as far as we can tell. I've never put handedness in a data set, but that's completely up to you. It's kind of whoever uploads it can decide which of those variables go in there. And so that's one aspect. Every data set is a little different, and they decide which of their neuroimaging data they upload. Now you can absolutely attach other data to a BIDS directory. There's a whole directory called derivatives, which is designed to store in BIDS is designed to store any analysis products you've produced from the neuroimaging data you collected that you also want to share. So people put like FreeSurfer directories in there, for example, after you run FreeSurfer. And that's because the FreeSurfer data is all derived from your neuroimaging data. The BIDS standard is really loose about what's in derivatives. So if you want to put genetic data in derivatives, it's not truly a derivative of the neuroimaging data, but the BIDS standard will accept it. So it will let you do that. However, I wouldn't put genetic data on Open Neuro because genetic data is personal health information. And so it would probably violate some laws if you did that. And so in general, you won't find that on Open Neuro because you would need someone to agree to some kind of restricted data access agreement in order to have access to that. So what you will sometimes find is people will put data sets up there and they'll put their neuroimaging data on Open Neuro, but then they'll have instructions for how you can get in touch with them to get the other more sensitive data or something like that. So it's going to be very case by case. If you look at Open Neuro itself, almost every data set has a big description of kind of what's in the data set. That's actually part of the BID standard, is to write a description of your data set, which I think is really great. A lot of people use it just to put the title, but nonetheless. So typically, if they have that kind of data, they'll put it in the description and you can figure it out and just get in touch and get it. For hack projects, a lot of times the restricted data is the most interesting thing, because if you want to if you want to do a hack project, for example, where you take T1 weighted images and you try to predict someone's behavioral data, someone's genetic data, someone's age, or who's twins or something like that, all that data is probably going to be restricted. Those things you're trying to predict, or a lot of it will be. But so I encourage you to look into that and think about that as a project. It may be difficult to get access to those data in 5 days that we have, but we can help you and do our best. Yeah, and for the Human Connectome project and the Healthy Brain Network data, like I already have access to the restricted data. I can't just give it to you, but if you've signed the form, then I can definitely work with you to I'll give you a fake data set that's just like it, and then you can test your code, and then you can give me the code, and then I'll run it on restricted data or something like that. We can figure that out. Yeah, good question.
Thank you.
What was your question?
It's kind of very niche, but I was kind of wondering about kind of on the machine learning kind on the spectrum, we're not quite up, like down very far end. I was kind of wondering about dynamic causal modeling.
Dynamic causal modeling.
I know it's very niche.
I unfortunately know almost nothing about dynamic causal modeling. Is this something, so here's a question. Do you think, and the answer may be no, and that's fine. Do you think it would be useful for me to Google it and for us to try to work through what it is together and then talk about it?
I'd say probably a bit of work done myself is more just it's supposed to be very time intensive versus other modeling methods in terms of fMRI.
Yeah.
But it is supposed to be more tailored to fMRI. So it's kind of more of a question of, is it worth the time investment?
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't just have an answer there.
As I said, it's a very niche question.
Yeah, so dynamic causal modeling tell me if I'm right here. It's about trying to deduce how a signal is propagating from one place to another, and like how this time course might have led to this time course out of the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, so I can understand why it would be time consuming, because if just to think about that in an abstract level, let's say we're going to just take just the voxels in the gray matter, and there's something like 200,000 of those maybe gray matter voxels. And then we want to look at, we're going to look at one voxel and then look at another voxel and see if the signal in this first voxel looks like the signal in the second voxel, just with a bit of delay. So now we're looking at every voxel to every other voxel on some level. And we're looking at every voxel to every other voxel times some delay that we have to check for.
Yeah.
And so I believe that it's very time intensive.
And you have to the other surveys, the model thing like psychological and like biological variables as well. So that's the other thing.
Sure.
Building the models, building models is there then basically.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just not sure if it's worth like time investment.
Well, worth the time is a really hard question to answer. It depends how much computing time you have.
Yeah.
I would say that it would be really amazing to have a data set and a technique where you felt like you could say, look, there's a signal here that's propagating to over here. That's something we can't easily do with fMRI most of the time, especially because fMRI is like, on the order of seconds. And so we're really looking at blood flow and we're not looking at neurodynamics where you would get a much clearer signal for that kind of thing. So yeah, and unfortunately I can't tell you more than just kind of this stuff on here, but yeah. Yeah, so dynamic causal model would be a great topic for like a breakout session next week. If you were interested in it, we could have a great breakout session where we just kind of look, read a paper about it and talk about it a little bit or something like that. That would be absolutely, especially if there's a few people interested. Yeah. I'd be interested in doing that just because it's something I would like to learn more about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is also kind of a niche question in a really different way. I am trying to so this might, I think based on the question that was asked earlier, I'm not sure if OpenNeuro has this, so even regardless of whether OpenNeuro has it or not, do you know by chance if there is a data set focused on adolescent fMRI that, well, as long as it includes adolescent, I suppose, but where individuals have been asked about exposure to violence in any capacity?
Ooh, that's a good question. So the most likely large data set I can think of to have a question like that is the ABCD data set. You are familiar with the ABCD? Have you worked with it?
I have, and maybe, I mean, Audrey gave me the suggestion to maybe try to look for a proxy variable because ABCD, for whatever reason, I haven't been able to find a violence exposure variable, which is odd in a way, I guess, because I also would think, but maybe I have to look for a proxy. But yeah, I'm kind of coming up short, and I'm kind of like, because there's a data set that I've been telling everybody about that does have it. It's just the sample size is so small.
Yeah, so that's what I would expect is that there are certainly labs that are looking at those kinds of things. And they've probably done some fMRI experiments where they also included a screener where they asked about exposure to violence or something. I'm sure those data sets are out there somewhere. What I'm not sure of is whether they're public, whether they're more than a handful of subjects. Yeah, I just am not sure. That's there are these nice, great big public data sets out here, but we're still just kind of entering the age of public data sets in neuroscience, unfortunately. So a lot of these kinds of questions just don't have good candidates yet. Now, that said, I'm gonna assume that's the Blue Angels.
Yeah.
That said, let's just go to OpenNeuro. Whoops. So the thing I would be looking for is possibly in addition to, so we can go ahead and pick MRI as a modality here. And then in addition to violence, which I'm assuming you've searched for at some point, valence is not quite the same as violence. So, well, this tells you something. There's not a whole lot of, there doesn't appear to be any data sets with violence in the title. But what I might try looking for is something like psychopathology, where it's like people who are looking for correlations with psychopathology in later age, who might be looking at things like violence and exposure to violence at younger ages. I don't know that I have high hopes that this is going to be like, well, so something like this. This is a multivariate assessment of inhibitory control in youth, links with psychopathology and brain function. Violence doesn't appear in here. This is the kind of study that I might think might have asked their subjects if they had exposure to violence at a young age. So this would be my intuition, is that if you're looking for that data set, look for this kind of space. Yeah, it'll probably be in a clinical study of some kind. Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer. I actually think if you messaged Jen Forsyth, she might have a better idea of where to look. Yeah.
That's great, yeah.
Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
And as far as, the oh my gosh, wow, reproducibility, can't spell it, can't say it, problem goes, I mean, is sample size the only, I think, solution to that problem that
So-
has been looked at?
Reproducibility?
Or, well, as in like the reproducibility crisis or
Yeah,
whatnot,
yeah.
and like trying to improve sample sizes in research to try to skirt around that issue, is that like, I mean, I guess I'm just trying to figure out, like, if I really was interested in trying to do like lead variable modeling,
Mhm.
are there any other ways I can explore associations with violence without needing like a massive sample size? Like, I mean, anything like even crafty, like trying to do even a harmonization of multiple data sets that are disparate in a way, or even like a meta-analysis comparing like a small exposure group to a larger control group. I'm just trying to think of like,
Yeah.
and sorry, this might be a way bigger conversation.
No, this is a great question, and so just be prepared for my answer to be a little over the place.
Yeah.
So I'll start by just saying, just to clarify some terms, there's the reproducibility crisis, which is a lot of is just about the fact that when people publish papers and other people read them, they can't understand the methods well enough that even if they had the same data, they could do the same analysis. So part of that, and I get that that's not exactly what you're asking about, but part of that is part of the reproducibility crisis is just documenting things well and providing software and publishing your data.
Thank you, yeah.
Yeah. Now there's also like a crisis of replicability and of generalizability, which is something like, can you take, if I knew your analysis method, can I find it in another data set? And there's a problem. That's more the problem that we get when we have small sample sizes, where we're very likely to get a significant result that's not there. So that's kind of a sort of subset of the larger reproducibility crisis, and I think more what you're getting at. And I would say that, yeah, there's, aside from, I mean, getting bigger sample sizes is obviously the single best thing you can do for just about any study you want to do. And that's just reality. But beyond that, you can have, you can increase your power to some extent by having a more constrained hypothesis. So if you're looking for just one precise thing, you may only need 30 subjects to find it, especially if the effect size is strong enough. That said, if your effect size is weak, you're just kind of going to be stuck. And this is unfortunately just the reality of effect sizes. If we're looking for something that is just barely an effect that you can find in 1,000 people on average, then you're going to need 1,000 people to measure it reliably, and that's unfortunate. As far as doing things that are clever, well, I'd say, and you're thinking specifically about fMRI data?
Yes, I mean, I guess I could bore everyone with a specific question now, which is an option, but I mean, and this might be maybe a conversation that we can maybe have later, but essentially, to be as brief as I possibly can be, I'm interested in latent variable modeling specifically with fMRI because, and I'm fully aware there's been one paper on this, okay? And it wasn't even an actual paper, it was a how-to guide, hilariously. But that came out in 2019. But anyway, the reason I'm interested in it is because among exposures to violence, tons of clinical psychologists have noted that we don't really know how different types of violence or trauma differentially impact development. We know the violence impacts development, great, but like what comes next, right? And so I think what I'd be curious about is if there was a way to almost compare different violence groups and explore how functional connectivity among each of these groups differ as a way of basically making not a causal link, I'm not looking for causality necessarily, but just to better understand if there is some predictability that can be generated to how certain types of violence might differentially affect FC.
I see. So, I mean, so the study you're kind of abstractly describing here sounds to me like much more of an exploratory analysis. And I want to be clear that there's nothing wrong with that. That's not like, it's not bad science to do exploratory analyses or anything. It's bad science to do an exploratory analysis and then pretend like you had a hypothesis that you tested all along. That's the problem that we get a lot of times in papers. I think the biggest problem in my experience with exploratory analysis is getting funding for them, is getting someone to support you in doing it. And that often just comes down to convincing the right people that your idea is grounded enough in reality, in like the literature or in other people's analyses, that it's worth trying. And the fact that a lot of clinical psychologists have observed this, or have observed that violence has a big role in development, seems to me like good justification to do this exploratory analysis. But beyond that, my expertise is not such that I can really tell you how to go about that. This is another good question for Jen, actually. I think she would
Okay,
likely
so
have a good
maybe
perspective.
Jen's my next.
Yeah. She's kind of our clinical representative here this year, yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Mhm. Other questions before we maybe jump into machine learning? Anything?
Might just add
Yeah.
to Maya.
Yeah.
We had a master student who was looking at subgrouping people by the cohorts, I think it's the same institute, cohorts of early life university patterns.
Yeah.
And what I think he was initially thinking of using latent code analysis, because it seemed to fit. The issue was the sample size wasn't large enough to do that.
Classic.
But that doesn't, exactly, yeah, so I don't know, if we manage, I think kind of variations of that would be quite useful for you to look into. I think latent code analysis does need quite large, sample size is the only thing. And if you are kind of looking at maybe subgrouping people by the types of violence, or particularly if there's different measures used and stuff, that might be a good kind of route to go down. But again, I know where it's easier said than done when you should recruit the people,
Yeah,
But, yeah.
it wouldn't even be primary data collection at this point.
Yeah.
And and that's, I think, I feel like, of course, the long-term goal would be, I mean, which I feel like it would probably take more than a lifetime, I think, to generate this anyway, but yeah, anyway, we can talk more about it. I think, I think the sample I do have, it's 187 people total.
That's pretty
that's what
big
we
as
were
neuroscience goes, yeah.
But like with a latent variable, that would mean, I mean, and I have to also like learn a little bit more about this as I go, but it's like, to my knowledge, that would mean you would still need enough of a sample to be able to segment the groups of violence exposure. And that means you might get to 50 people,
Right.
which is, so I don't know, but we'll figure it out as we go.
I've actually pointed out roughly the sample size we were working as well.
Okay.
So it's kind of, we were in around that 180 to 200 kind of group. So I think in the end, he decided, because he was provided a certain length of time, he was like, okay, I'm just going to do something slightly, because there's only a master's thesis. But we did look into latent component analysis at the start, and it did seem like the most suitable option. If we had a few more people and need a bit more time, kind of thing. So,
Yeah. That's really good to know. Maybe it would be interesting to even talk to him at some point about it. Thank you.
Another kind of trailing thought there is that if you have an idea for the kind of analysis you want to do, you might be able to find something else that's some other latent variable, not violence necessarily, that's much more commonly measured, that you could test your analysis in. That would give you an idea of like what kind of effect size you actually need to detect, to reliably measure something.
So wait, sorry, just to make sure I understand. So you're maybe saying like, kind of, if it isn't violence specifically, maybe try to look for something that is already present in ABCD.
Yeah, so
something like that.
for example, and I'm just making this up, this isn't really my area, so I'm not sure what variables are measured, but there may be a lot of studies that, for example, have assessed whether families were food secure growing up, like whether they had access to good nutrition growing up. That's not violence, but it may be something that you can find in a lot of studies and get a big subject pool for. And then if you could show, look, we can do this latent variable analysis on food security, that now you have an analysis pipeline that would work in theory for something like violence.
Sure.
It's sort of like you can test your methods this way, and then that's one half of the whole, is this worth measuring? Well, look, I've got a method that'll work, and I also have a reason to think that this is important, and something like that.
Yeah, thanks. So like maybe even starting with something that is less exploratory, but I would have enough of the sample size to do it, and perhaps a little bit more rigor.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Totally.
Appreciate it.
I saw, Nancy, you had your hand up. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question that might be super basic, and in regards to the Docker lecture.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, So the idea is that you have within these containers your files and the programs that you need in order to run them. Um, I guess like, if you modify the files, can you pull out like, I guess, the files after modification, after everything you've done with them already? Can you pull them
Yeah.
back? And also, like, I guess if I were to pitch it to my PI, like, oh, I want to start using these type of methods to increase reproducibility, but it's not something that the rest of the lab does. Like, I guess, like, how can I pitch to my PI, like, instead of us just logging what versions we use in our script or something, it would be better to use this. Like, I guess, is it something that you see the field moving towards entirely, or like, is it just like on a person by
Yeah,
person?
that's a great question. So I'll answer that last part first. And I would say, so if your PI isn't familiar with Docker and you're trying to convince them to let you use it, one of the main arguments I would give them is kind of what you just said, which is that once you've put the analysis pipeline in Docker, you never have to worry about it again. It is set, and Docker will run it in 10 years or 20 years, assuming we don't drastically change things about computers and at that time such that the software is obsolete. But you never have to go back and maintain that later. If you just keep a GitHub repository, I promise you in 5 years, someone's going to email you and say, hey, I tried to run your GitHub repository, but I couldn't get it to work because my NumPy is version 4 and yours doesn't work with version 4, something like that. When you have it in Docker, none of that matters. They just pull the Docker and run it, and everything that you need is inside the Docker. So it really does save you a lot of time down the road, as far as just handling requests for reproducibility and using your code and that kind of thing. I would, if you're like in a lab that is primarily like a MATLAB lab or something like that, where everything you do is inside of an ecosystem already, that's a little bit harder of a sell. But if you're doing, if you're in a lab that does a lot of like Python or any other language really, then there's a lot of advantages that come with just having it all packaged up in one place. So your other question, which is a great one, and one that I kind of meant to talk about on the Docker Day, is can you copy, once you've made the Docker, can you get files out of it? And the answer is definitely yes. Let me just, okay. I'm here at my bash prompt. I don't actually have Docker running, so let me just start it up real quick. This will take just a minute. So we were working with this Docker Alpine Sun, and I'm not entirely sure. I might have already cleared out my Docker images, so I may not have it anymore, and I may have to use a different example. 1 second while this starts. There we go. Okay. So if I Docker image list, we can see all these Docker images, and if I Docker container list --all, we should see some of these. Okay, yeah. So I don't remember the exact syntax off the top of my head, but there is a Docker copy command, and I'm just going to say Docker copy -- help and see what it says. It's not Docker copy, it's Docker CP, like the Linux command. And okay, so it looks like the way it works is you copy out of a container as opposed to an image. So let me do Docker container list -- all. And I'm just going to pick out the last Alpine Sun container. This was the command we ran, was Python Sun there. And I'm going to grab the container ID, which is this hexadecimal string. I'm just going to copy that. And then we can just say Docker copy. Then we put the container ID in a colon. And I'm just going to say take the /etc/ let's take the /sum.py that we put in there, that Python file, and I'm going to copy it to /sum.py. And now if I cat sum.py, we can see it's right here. Yeah, there's the file. So it's actually very easy, even for that container that's no longer running, that is now stopped. We can just take anything inside the Docker and copy it out, and it's no problem at all. Yeah. And I use this all the time, actually, because there's a lot of Dockers that, like the fMRI prep Docker and the FreeSurfer Dockers and those kinds of things, have files in them that sometimes you want to just grab, like the FS average subject data or something like that. And you can use Docker copy to get it out of there.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
Right, another question, but for like, do you have any experience using like different programs or for like say harmonizing data, like from multi-sites, as in like either clinical measures, like, you know, they might have assessed a certain cognitive measure or a certain phenotype, but and again, similar with brain imaging, like different protocols, but like I know there's like combat, and that's like used a good bit.
Okay.
I don't know if there are any other.
You've hit on a topic that I know very little about, unfortunately. So harmonizing data is a really important topic, especially for like clinical studies. I study vision, and we have really good models of vision. We use pretty much the same stimuli everywhere, and so there's harmonizing just is not a big problem in vision the way it is in a lot of other subfields of fMRI and neuroscience. JB Pleen, however, has thought a lot about harmonizing data sets, and he's written some tools, NePoppy, and I think NePoppy is like one of the main ones. But I would highly recommend getting in touch with him and chatting about this, because he'll have a lot of information to give you. There you go. Yeah, sorry, I can't give you a better answer there. Other questions? No? Okay, well, I'm happy to talk about machine learning, as was suggested earlier. But also, you know, we can spend the next several hours talking about machine learning and still have only kind of dipped our toes in the water. So I just want to make sure if anyone else has any other questions, feel free to jump in or interrupt or anything like that if anything comes up. Yeah.
I think especially the measures restricted. Like if we do want to do a project and use, so basically we just kind of like write the code and then give it to you and then you run it and then give it back. Is that
yeah, so we can do a little better than that, in that so say you want to do an analysis that involves the twins, like you want to do a heritability analysis on the human connectome project data. And you want to look at the sizes of some part of the brain and you want to see if there's a heritability to it or something like that. What I can do is I can give you a fake restricted data set. Like I'll give you the file that is exactly like the restricted data set CSV file. And the restricted data is just a CSV file. It's a CSV file with every subject and a whole bunch of columns for every metric they measured. And I'll give you a file just like it, but where the data is fake. It's not the real connections between subjects, or it's not the real the real twin status. And you can write your analysis to work and test it with that file. And then once you've got it working with that file, we'll be pretty sure it'll work on the real file. You can give me the code then and I'll run it. And probably we can just sit down together and I can run it real quick. And then give you the answers back. Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, we should be able to work something like that out. And also once you've signed the restricted data form, I'm not super worried about it. Like the HCP needs to approve it before you can have the restricted data, but I'm not super worried about you using it once you've signed it. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions that came up? All right. So the request earlier was to do like another hands-on example of deep learning or machine learning. And I guess let's just let me just ask more generally. In the deep learning tutorial, we kind of dove into PyTorch and doing, we looked at optimization, and then we looked at generally, and then we looked at this neural network we built. Would it be useful to back up and talk about machine learning principles at a slightly higher level? Is that pretty solid? Would we like to just jump in and do some coding? Is that?
Yeah. Did everyone who went to the deep learning?
Oh, you weren't in the deep learning?
I was at machine learning as well.
Oh, I see.
So,
Oh, I see.
Advanced for me.
If folks are okay, I'd be happy to just start with the basics.
Okay.
If that's okay.
So, who was in the deep learning session with me? It was a fairly small session, so maybe none of you. Okay. Okay, great. This actually helps a lot. This means I can reuse the same material.
I don't know anything. Yeah.
1 second. Let me just find.
Just gonna all be floating.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just going to go to the curriculum and go to my Benson deep learning section, and so what I'll do here is I'm just going to kind of talk through some of the topics in the deep learning session that we went through, and we can just kind of walk through some of the code. I won't live code it this time. We don't really have time for me to live code it, but I can show you the kind of the code that we did. So first of all, has anyone used PyTorch before or TensorFlow? Okay, so how about NumPy? Have you all used NumPy? At least seen NumPy a little bit? Yeah, so NumPy is such a standard in Python. It is like it's a really great library, and it lets you have multidimensional arrays, and it's got all kinds of math stuff in it. And PyTorch was built to have almost exactly the same interface. So if you know NumPy's interface, you mostly know PyTorch's interface. And so here in this cell block here, you can ignore most of this, but the main thing here is that we just import Torch, which is the PyTorch module. I guess I'll go ahead and run this. I have a cell here that the whole point of this cell is just to demonstrate that the syntax for PyTorch is basically the same as NumPy. So if you want to make a bunch of zeros, if you want to make a 10×3 matrix of zeros, you use the torch.zeros function just like you would use the numpy.zeros function if you were using NumPy. And here, if we want to assign the first column to all be ones, we just use the exact same syntax we would for NumPy. We can have run these operations, u equals u minus a half times 3. All this works exactly the same way. The main difference is that instead of an array, we have a tensor. And tensor is just the math term for array, basically. Tensors, like 0-dimensional tensors are numbers, 2-dimensional tensors are matrices, 3-dimensional tensors are 3-dimensional arrays. That's all that really needs. So tensors are just an array tensors are just an alias for arrays that are managed by PyTorch. And the only kind of caveat here is that PyTorch and NumPy don't always play nicely together, despite the fact that they have almost the same interface. So here, if we import NumPy and make a matrix of zeros, we can't use PyTorch to take the mean of it. It'll give us an error because it basically says, you didn't give me a tensor, you gave me an array, and I don't know what to do with an array. Now, there's a really good reason why PyTorch doesn't work with arrays the way you would expect. PyTorch is made to be an optimization library, first and foremost. Now, we associate PyTorch with neural networks and convolutional neural networks in particular, but all neural networks and all of the fancy deep learning that is part of machine learning, the way we train all of that is just by basic optimization. So I'm going to step back here and say, how many of you have heard of Newton's algorithm? No. Okay, great. So no, that's honestly, that's more or less what I expected. You typically wouldn't have learned about Newton's algorithm unless you took like a numerical methods course in the CS department or something, or maybe like you might talk about it in like a machine learning course or a linear regression course or something. But okay, so let me, in this session I used the trackpad to try to draw some stuff to explain it. Didn't go super well, so let me try just Googling Newton's method. And I bet there is an animated GIF that does a better job of explaining it than I can. Please tell me that's an animated GIF. It is not. Try one more time. Newton's method, animated GIF. Yes, this is what we want. Okay. Okay, so the idea here, what we're seeing, I wish I could slow this down. Can we slow it down? I cannot. Okay. What we're seeing is this blue line represents some function. It doesn't matter what this function is. The point is that we can calculate it. Someone's given us a Python function that takes X as input and calculates Y. And we don't know what is inside of X or F. We don't know what is inside of that function F. We just know that we can use it to calculate for any X we give it, we can get a Y out. So if we want to try to find the point at which this function is equal to 0, for example, or a lot of times what we're doing is if we're trying to minimize some function to find the lowest value of the function, we might be trying to find the point at which the function's derivative is 0, and then we can tell that that's a minimum or a maximum. But regardless, if we're trying to find some point on this function, like where it's equal to 0, we can use Newton's method, which is just to guess some random x, and then we calculate y. And then we can calculate, if we can calculate y for any x, we can calculate the derivative of f at x by just picking a slightly different x, like just a small difference, and then calculating the derivative by a finite difference method. So we can always calculate a derivative of the function f at x. And that's what these red lines are showing. They're showing you the slope at the tangent point, so the derivative basically. And if you follow that derivative decreasing and find where it intersects with the x-axis, you'll just about always find a point that is much closer to the point at which it crosses the 0 or to the minimum. And you can just do that repeatedly until, and you'll just iteratively get closer and closer to the minimum or to the 0 point, whichever you're looking for. This is like a tried and true method that's used all over optimization. In fact, even some of the, like when you call numpy.x to calculate an exponent, that's a bad example because they don't do it this way. But there's some of those low-level functions in NumPy actually use this kind of method under the hood to figure out what the solution to something is. So you can use this Newton's method, which involves calculating gradients or derivatives, in order to very quickly approach a minimum in the function. So even if all of this, to step back, if you don't understand exactly how this method works, that's fine. It's not important to understand exactly how this method works. The important thing is that if you can efficiently calculate derivatives or gradients for multivariable functions, you can efficiently minimize it, or you can efficiently find a minimum. Now, you may have heard of local and global minimums. The global minimum of a function is just the lowest point anywhere in it. The global minimum is the lowest point anywhere. The local minimum is just it's the closest minimum point to whatever point you started with. So if now in this particular example, it's not a great example because there is no minimum here. Like the minimum goes off the page. But if, for example, we had a function that looked like this, and we guessed this as our first x, we would follow the gradient this way, and we'd follow the gradient, and eventually we'd get here where the gradient's flat. And we'd say, oh, there's the minimum. But it's not the minimum, it's not the global minimum, it's just the local minimum. So when people talk about worrying about whether or not your optimization has found a local minimum, this is what they're talking about. Okay, let me clear all that. All right, so again, not too important that you understand this method exactly or anything, but the important thing to understand here is that gradient calculations, derivative calculations are very central to optimization of any kind, whether you're optimizing a neural network or you're just trying to find the minimum of a function. All of these involve taking a guess and then making a little step that makes you a little bit closer to your minimum. And you can take that little step by following the gradient. Okay, so now in the actual session, we had a lot of time, so I did this kind of really arbitrary example where we did an optimization problem that was just about finding a minimum. And I'll just show you what it looks like. We made this kind of Star Trek communicator-like symbol. And then the goal was to find the point on this curve that was closest to 0, which ends up being somewhere around here. And we just kind of demonstrated that you can do that by calculating the distance from a point on the curve to the 0 and then minimizing that distance. And depending on what you guessed, you would either find something over here or something over here, or because there's definitely local minima in this function. anyway, this was kind of an abstract example of optimization, and we're just gonna skip it for now. But a lot of what, okay, so getting back to the whole notion that tensors, there's a reason that PyTorch cares about tensors and doesn't just work with arrays. And it's because whenever you're working with PyTorch, PyTorch is secretly in the background, keeping track of everything you're doing and making this graph of all the computations you've produced, so that when you ask it for the gradient, it can really quickly look back at the computations you did, and without having to do the finite differences method of looking at two close by points, which can be very slow, it can actually just look and say, oh, look, you calculated the sine of X, and then you asked me for the gradient. Well, I know the derivative of sine of X, it's cosine X, so I can just calculate that. I don't know if you'll remember from calculus, but in calculus 1, you typically learn that any function that you can express a derivative for, but you can't necessarily express an integral for it. I don't know if you all knew that we were going to be doing calculus in this session, but basically, PyTorch uses that capability. Since you can always calculate a derivative based on whatever calculation you did, or whatever set of operations you did, it in the background keeps track of the operations you did and will just give you the derivative when you ask for it. Now, that is a very powerful thing, it ends up, at least in my experience, it can be very powerful. It means that if you have some really complicated function you've come up with, like I have a bunch of vertices on the cortical surface and I know how close they are to each other, and I want to enforce the smoothness of some bold activation across a visual area or something like that, and you can come up with a metric that measures smoothness, you can basically just write that function, however complicated it is, and then say, okay, PyTorch, I've got a smoothness number, minimize it, and PyTorch will do it. And that's kind of where the magic lies here. So no matter how complicated your function is, you don't have to calculate the gradient yourself. Okay, I'll pause there. Questions so far? This is all very abstract so far, I realize, so it's not necessarily easy to get a handle on. But okay, so this is an example of optimization. I'm going to skip it for now. Oh yeah, go ahead.
One of the differential calculus are different. I'm getting confused because it sounds like when I would have done differential calculus, but I don't know if it's the same thing.
So I would say Newton's method uses differential calculus.
Okay.
It relies very heavily on differential calculus to do that job. But it's really just a strategy for like the fundamental idea in pretty much all optimization is that we make a guess, and if we can just tweak that guess and make it a little closer to the actual answer we're looking for, then we've got a strategy, because we can just do that over and over again until we get to where we're looking for it. And there's a whole set of if you take a numerical analysis course, they'll tell you about how to analyze how quickly you're getting to your optimization point and stuff like that. But we're just going to ignore that. But yeah, otherwise I think you're exactly right. It's a differential calculus method, or it uses differential calculus.
Yeah, it doesn't mean where they're like the same or like overlapping.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I studied Newton's method in the calculus class I took as like part of the course material, but it was more like we studied it more as like, oh, look, here's a really real world example of using calculus, and I think that's debatable, but regardless, that's kind of like something that might come up in the class, but I don't know. I mean, if you ask someone who studied like if you asked a math professor whether they would say that Newton's method is part of calculus or not, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it
Yeah,
matters.
I've had it similar. Going to just studying physics for a rate of change kind of thing, and the same in maths. So I was kind of like, could they do learn the same?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so this cell is just an example of doing an optimization, the optimization I talked about, where we're finding the point closest to 0 on this weird curve. But I'm not going to run that right now. It's sort of an abstract example. So down here, and this is where I think it gets a little more interesting. So the rest of this notebook goes through an example of training a neural network to take as inputs an image that's of like a drawn numeral, like a handwritten numeral 0 through 9. And so the first thing we need to do is, sorry, I stopped that in the middle. we train a neural network to take an image of a hand-drawn numeral and predict what the actual numeral represented in the picture was. So in order to train a neural network to do that, we first of all need a data set. We need a data set of hand-drawn numerals of images, and we need those images to be labeled with the number they contain. So we need a set of images and labels. And these are already on the hub. They're just in the shared directory, and these commands just load them in. So here we load in a training data set and a test data set. Training and test data sets are probably something that were discussed in the machine learning session. But the idea behind training and test is that if you don't have a separate training and test data set, you can very easily overfit your model. So people know what I mean when I say overfit? Okay. So in order to not overfit, we use the training data set to take the steps, but then after we've taken some steps, we pull out the test data set and say, these actually make it better. If they made it better on the test data set without actually using the test data set to make the steps, that tells us that we're generally getting better and not just getting better at the training data. Yeah. So that's how we'll use those. Now, when we read these in, these are just PyTorch, kind of like you can write out NumPy files with numpy.save. You can do the same thing with PyTorch. So these are just PyTorch files. And they contain a vector of labels and a 3D array of images. And I'll just show you what these look like. So training labels is just training is just a list of like the first image is a 5 and the second image is of a 0 and the third image is of a 4. That's all this means. And then if we look at training images, and we'll just start with shape, it's 600,000 by 28 by 28. So this is, sorry, 60,000. 60,000 images of different numerals. And I'll just go ahead and plot one of them so you can see it. So we know that the first one is supposed to be a numeral of 5. So if we say training images 0, okay, that looks like a 5, I guess, or close enough. So that's a 5. If we look at the next one, it should be a 0, etc. Okay. So you get the idea here. We've got a set of images and we've got labels that go with them that tell us what digit that image represents. So this block of code just basically tells PyTorch how we have these organized. So we've got images and labels. PyTorch doesn't necessarily know what our data looks like, so it doesn't necessarily expect us to give it a big array of images and a vector of labels. And so to tell PyTorch how we have the data organized, we overload what's called the dataset class. We have not talked about object-oriented programming this course at all. Who would like a quick review of what object-oriented programming is to understand this? Yeah, okay. Okay, so object-oriented programming. The idea is that a lot of times when you're programming or you're writing a library or something like that, you've got some kind of data you represent. Maybe it's like an fMRI scan. It's the bold signal from fMRI scan. That scan data is going to have some values associated with it, like the size, the shape of the data, the affine transformation that aligns the structural data to the functional data. It's going to have information about the TR time and the slice time correction and all this kind of stuff that goes with bold data. And you may want to be able to do certain operations on that data. Like you may want to be able to denoise that kind of data. So in a sense, what you have is kind of a data type by itself that consists of not just the voxels and all of their bold signals, but also of this metadata like the TR and also these operations you can do on it. And what people decided many years ago, back in like the 70s and 80s, was that it was often very useful to consider that data type like a black box with some buttons on the outside. And so you can push one of the buttons and that's like the give me the data button, and it'll spit out your bold time series. Or you can push another button and it's the denoise this data using some algorithm, and it'll spit out the denoise data. And the idea is you don't have to worry about what's going on inside that black box. You just have to worry about what the buttons do. That's the fundamental idea behind object-oriented programming. And then, so the way that we conceptualize object-oriented programming is we have what's called a class. A class is really just an alias for a type. We have a class that we declared, or we declare, and we can define both methods inside of the class, and we can also define what are called member variables, like here. So here we're declaring a class. I'll tell you what this means in a second. But inside of this class, we're declaring an initialization function. And in Python, initialization functions are always called underscore underscore init underscore underscore. That's just how Python decides to name them. And whenever someone makes a new instance of this class, like they make a new object of this class, the first thing it does is it runs the init function. And it passes the init function the new object that it just made of this, that is of this type. So self here, self refers to the object of this type that's being initialized in this function. And here we require a couple arguments, the images and the labels. And here we're saying self.images, that is one of the pieces of data that this class keeps track of is the images. We're just setting that to be images.float here. And self.labels, we're just setting to be the labels. So really all we're doing is taking some variables that are passed to the initialization function and saving them as pieces of data inside this object. And then we have a couple other functions we define here. And functions of classes are typically called methods. That's just the vocabulary term we use for them. But same idea, they're just functions. This getItem function, getItem is what gets called if I say like x of 10, that what actually gets called underneath, what actually gets called underneath the hood is x dot underscore underscore getItem. That's what actually gets called. And this x over here gets passed in as the self.
And that's just because it's already been programmed.
That's because Python specifically, it has decided that underscore underscore getItem is the name of that operation. Yeah. And so earlier we saw these underscore underscores in one of the sessions and we just kind of glossed over them. Those underscore underscores are all like private or particular Python names for other operations in the Python library. So those are all kind of built-in Python terms. What was your question?
That's just the same as like putting a slice, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. The getItem is really about getting a single item or a slice or whatever out of an object. But there's also dictionaries. Like dictionaries, you can pass a string to getItem, and dictionaries just implement a different function in here that handles strings instead of integers. Yeah. Yep. Good question. Underscore underscore len is what happens when you call len of x. It just calls that len function. So really, they're not that complicated. Classes are just a way to bundle some data and some operations all together. Yeah.
I thought this is the intro of the Python session too. She's like, oh, the greater than or equal sign is like also this other function.
Yep.
Like, where do you look up the mapping of symbols to functions?
That's a great question. Yeah, that's a really good question. They are in the Python documentation. That is not to say that they're easy to find or understand or anything. So Python abstract, I'm always frustrated at how hard it is to find this mapping. Basically, I think we need to look up abstract classes. Okay, well, I'm not sure that that's the way I would typically find this is just to Google Python and then a few examples of those. So like underscore underscore len, underscore underscore greater than is GT, equal, actually I don't think equal is right. Operator, standard operator is this one. Here's the mapping. Okay, so I mean, you see though that it wasn't obvious. This isn't something that this is something you can go find. Like it is documented out there, and there's lots of Stack Overflow questions about this and stuff. But it's also considered like a slightly more advanced feature to overload these operators. And so you won't find them in like the introductory chapter of a book on Python classes typically. So they're just a little trickier to find. There's a whole bunch of them. Some of which are you probably will never use or never realize you need to use, and that's fine. But they're occasionally useful, and you will see them on occasion. Someone, yeah, question.
I just have a quick question about the notation of it underscore. What's to do with that?
I don't know where that came from. So keep in mind that Python was written a long time ago. So C is a very old language that goes back to probably the 50s. I'd have to look it up exactly when it came, when C was written. And Python was kind of written originally to be a scripting language on top of C. And I'm guessing Python was written in the 80s, but I need to check that as well. I'm not sure exactly when. And a lot of the things they decided early on in those days, before we had all the experience programming we have in the modern era, are just now baked into the language forever. And
So
that includes these.
Underscore thing, I should think, oh, that's a what?
Generally speaking, there's another use of underscore that is obscure enough that I've never had to use it. But if you okay, self.images here, this is setting a piece of data, and because it's just .images, because there's no underscore here, by convention it's public. But if I had said self._images, nothing is different about that except the name. But in the Python community, the convention is that that's now a private variable, and you shouldn't do anything with it unless you wrote the class. Now, underscore is also a private variable, but under the hood, when this class gets compiled or gets turned into like a type, they change. Python will change the name of this to something like underscore MNIST dataset underscore images. And the reason they do that is to make sure that if you've got two variables with the same names that you added to the class, this is getting like way down the rabbit hole. Regardless, you should never have to do this. I've never had to do this for the most part. So all I'm saying is that there's like a deeper thing going on there, but let's not worry about it. It's not important. Okay. Other questions about this? Okay, so when we declare this class, you notice that I put this thing in the parentheses here. Also notice that I capitalized the name of the class, and that's also a convention. We capitalize class names. We keep variable names lowercase. And that's just kind of that's a conventional across a lot of languages, but Python in particular. So we can guess that this data set symbol here, this is also a class. Yeah.
So, sorry to cover this. A class in this case can be defined as a piece of a neural network or an entire network, right?
It could be.
Really depends on whatever you have.
Yeah. So, I mean, the idea behind classes is they should be kind of modular, so you should be able to like kind of put them together. And so, depending on how you wanted to design your code, you could have a neural network that was a class, and we will look at a class that is a neural network in a minute here. And simultaneously, you could have the neural network be made up of a bunch of classes. It really just matters how you design your code and kind of conceptualize the way you're going to write your code.
Okay.
The way to think about classes is that they're a very kind of low-level tool in Python to wrap up some functionality and with some data that you kind of want to keep contained.
This would be basically like one piece, much larger puzzle. But...
Yeah, typically. Yeah.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so this data set here in this parentheses, what this is saying is that this MNIST data set we're creating, this class, should inherit from this other class. So inheritance is another part of classes, and the idea is that you can write a bunch of you can have some data and some functions encapsulated in your black box that's one class, and then you can just add a little extension to it by inheriting from it. And when you inherit from it, so if we deleted all of this and just put like pass here and then got rid of all this, if this MNIST dataset class would now be identical to this dataset class because we're inheriting, but we're not adding anything. So we would just have that. Here, now that we've added these methods, we've basically overwritten the init function from the dataset. We've overwritten the get item, and we've overwritten the length function from the dataset. Or if dataset didn't have these methods, we would have added them to it. So there's this pattern of inheritance, which can also be very useful for organizing your code. If you've got like a chunk of functionality that belongs to a lot of different types of data. For example, you've got structural images and functional images and diffusion images, and they all have shapes and TRs and scan parameters. You can write one class for a scan or for an image, and you could have it track things like the scan parameters and the TR length and stuff. And then you can overload it for the structural image and the functional image and the diffusion image, and just rewrite the pieces that go with those and not have to reproduce a bunch of code. And step back. Does that make sense to people? Any questions? Okay, you'll are either lost or doing really well because we're going through this quite quickly. This is like half a semester of CS of intro to programming CS. Okay, so really now let me back up and just say what this whole cell is about. PyTorch, when it's going to do training using a data set, it wants you to use its data set methods. And the idea is they wrote a bunch of methods into data set that will work with PyTorch in the background that you don't have to worry about. And then they're just saying, look, if you want to train it using our paradigm, just overload data sets and write these two functions, get item and len, and have them return just this particular kind of result, and everything will work with PyTorch now. So the PyTorch convention is that length just needs to say how many samples do you have in this data set. So that's just the number of labels we have or the number of images, either one, which is why we return the number of labels here. And for the get item, you have to return a tuple, the first of which is the input data, and the second of which is the output data. So you have we're going to generate a model that looks at the image and predicts the label. So our input data is when we ask for like the ith element, the input data is the ith image and the output data is the ith label.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
It's probably going to be incredibly rudimentary, but so you say, I mean, I understand that the idea is, you know, to generate a predictive model here, and PyTorch is supposed to do that for us. And so say, I mean, okay, I'm gonna actually start from very beginning. So your data set itself, like I asked you what a class was, and I think I understand that now, but like, could you perhaps give me an example of what make an appropriate class so I can better understand typically what quantity of images we're working with here?
What quantity of images?
Yes, like, because I guess the number of labels, the length, right, would be like potentially the unit might be a number of images that are being inputted into the class.
Yeah, I lost you somewhere. The unit might be the number of images. I don't know what you mean by units.
To ask an
Okay.
even more rudimentary question, because I think I missed something. So the length typically, is that what we are predicting or what is being inputted?
Okay, so the length here, so let me, I'll demonstrate this and it'll be clear. So here we're making a training data set that is of this type. And when we run this line, it'll take training images and training labels and pass them into the init function.
Yep.
And then we'll have one of these MNIST data sets. So let me go ahead and run this. Now, if I'll look at test data, that's an MNIST data set object, right? And if I look at test data.labels, which we set here in the initialization function, that will be the same. It's in fact exactly the same as test labels, because that's what we passed in and that's what we set. So far, so good?
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's look at the length of test labels. There's 10,000. Similarly, if we look at test images dot shape, we should have 10,000 by 28 by 28, and that's because the test data is a set of matched images to labels, and there's 10,000 of them. So now, when we ask for the length, of the test data set, it tells us 10,000.
It's 10,000.
Exactly, it's 10,000 samples that we can train with. And if we ask for, okay, give me the 10th item in this data set, give me the 10th sample, it gives us back a tuple, the first element of which is this 28 by 28 image, and the second element of which is the label, that's the digit that it is.
Yeah.
So all that this class is really here for is to provide this interface. Because PyTorch is written such that when you say, hey, PyTorch, go optimize this model using this data set, it's going to say, okay, how many samples do you have? I'll take the length of your data set. And then I'm going to iterate through I'm going to start with sample 1 and I'm going to train, and I'm going to do sample 2 and train, sample 3 and train. And so it needs a way to get your samples.
Yeah.
And we've just basically told it, here's how you can get it. We've overloaded the data set class. And so now we've provided PyTorch with an object that follows its kind of paradigm. That makes sense?
And, okay, and so, okay, so we're feeding it all of this test data, and the purpose is to generate the training data set. These are.
So typically we'll be feeding it the training data set. We'll be as for the training, yeah.
Sure.
And at each step of the training, it's going to use this image tensor to try to predict the label. Right? So,
Yes.
and just to kind of drive that home, if we say image label equals the 10th test data item, and we just plot the image, we should see that that's a 0. And so it's going to use this to try to predict that the label is 0. So fundamentally, we're going to make a model, and it's going to be like a sort of like a function, and we're going to say model of the image, and then we're going to ask if it's equal to the label.
And the label that we're referring to is basically the numerics that we initially discussed,
Exactly.
the whole reason we did this
Yeah, yeah.
example. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, clearly I'd forgotten that.
No problem.
Okay, amazing. And would you mind scrolling down?
Down?
No, back up. Sorry. Okay, all right, I think this makes sense. And then going just back, this is just just curious. So like, we have 10,000 images we discussed. This potentially could just be like how many ever subjects, but looking at maybe one neural network, or I mean, it could really be whatever.
Yeah.
But I guess if you're looking at something that, wow, words. So contrasting a class that's created out of a part of a neural network versus a class that's created out of images from like an entire neural network, would there be any additions to code to accommodate the fact that there's more data being inputted? Does that make sense?
So, well, somewhat, but so first of all, there's no neural network here yet. We haven't done anything with the neural network. We're just looking at the data. And the input and the output data.
Sure.
Or the data the neural network will use to make a prediction. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the neural network itself is independent of this. This is just how to organize the data.
I think I was just more curious, like what kinds of stuff we'd be even working with for the purpose of this example, and yeah, that would change.
It may make more sense in a minute when I show you.
Sure,
the
yeah.
network, yeah.
Keep going.
But what was your question?
I was kind of skipping ahead to the neural network
Mhm.
part because of time, but if you were just about to explain it.
I'm going there
I would
next.
save
Yeah.
that question for after.
Okay. Did you have a question?
No major overriding data set variables initially, while you're making your new class or whatever. When you say the way you have 3 arguments specified there, do the other arguments, if there were other arguments in the data set initially, would they just kind of be ignored, or do you have to?
Like if we
Do you
pass,
assume that there's, say, like, you don't even like, I don't know, do you know, like with BATA? You to like specify every item that you want to change in the batch. Or else it just will not like use the other arguments, like the arguments are
I see.
there, but if you don't specify them, just use them as null and
I see.
use them.
So Python uses a slightly different syntax.
Mhm.
So for example, if we tried to run this without the training labels here, it'll give us an error and basically say you're missing a required arguments.
I get you.
Now you can, you can say, for example, labels equals none. And then if you don't provide labels, it will default to being none.
Okay. I get you.
So
Yeah.
there are ways to do that same kind of thing. But in this case, we're requiring both of the arguments.
Would they be the only three like arguments that you have with the data set then? Or like if there are other ones that
For-
you could add if you wanted to?
Yeah, so you could absolutely add, and in general, like a lot of data sets will have lots of arguments. They may have arguments that are about like, oh, what order do you want these in? And do you want me to upsample the image and those kinds of things? Yeah, so that it's very common to have a lot more arguments here, but it's just going to matter what for your data set or like what kind of code or yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so we are running a little out of time, so I'm going to skip a little bit of this and go down and talk about the neural network here. So this is the class that actually defines the whole neural network. It takes remarkably little code, I think, to write a neural network in PyTorch, considering how complicated they can be. And I'll just kind of walk through and explain what these pieces of it are. So we have our neural network class, and we're overloading the torch.neuralnetwork.module. So this, you might have missed it, but earlier I said from torch import neural network. So neural network.module is another class that I don't know why they call it module and not model, but basically modules in PyTorch are models. They take some inputs and they predict some output, and that's really all they do. And fundamentally, when you overload the module class, there's one function you really have to write, and that's the forward function. Forward is the function that calculates the result of, like, it takes the input, which is X here, and has to return whatever your model calculates. That's really all there is to, fundamentally, that's all there is to a PyTorch module, which is a model. Now, of course, we're going to want to initialize our module. We're going to want to, create some structure that we then apply in the forward function. So I'll just walk through this here. The first thing we do, this is just a fancy line that says, hey, in addition to running this initialization method, go and run whatever initialization method they wrote in the module class. So that's all this first line does here. And then we declare a variable that's the neural network.flatten type. This is another class that they wrote in PyTorch. All that it does is it takes the input and it flattens it. So it takes your 28 by 28 image and makes it a whatever you get, whatever 28 by 28 is. It just makes it a flat vector instead of a 28 by 28 image. So down here, when in the forward function we call x equals self.flatten x, all that does is flatten, but it's not fancy. Okay, and then we have a neural network.sequential. All sequential means is that we start, so when we call this object that we're making here, we pass it x, and it takes x and it passes it to this first layer. And then whatever that layer outputs, it passes it to this layer. And whatever that layer outputs, it passes it to the next layer. And it's basically just a series of filters that filter the data. So what matters here is what is linear and what is ReLU. So linear is just what they call a very simple neural network. The idea is you tell it how many inputs you have, and we have 28 by 28. We have that many inputs in our image. And you tell it how many outputs you want it to have. And it's going to take our 28 by 28 and produce an output that's 512 elements long. And in between there it's a neural network. So there's an all-to-all set of weights between those 28 by 28 and 512 inputs and outputs. And those weights are the things we are training when we train the network. So the idea is that basically you can think of this as just a big linear expression. We've got for each of these 512 outputs, we've got a weighted sum of all the inputs. And by tweaking those weights, we can ideally get some outputs that help us calculate what the correct answer is here. Now, if you're sitting here wondering, wow, what possible weights would you come up with that would actually help with that? That's a really good question. Neural networks are kind of like magic that way, in that like you have these weights inside and they shuffle numbers around and somehow they come out with the right answer, and we can't really understand the calculation going on inside. In theory, you can go and look at the weights and you can write out an equation that says the prediction we have is this sum of weights times the input, and then we take those and we do another sum of weights, and that's fundamentally how a neural network works. But actually trying to understand what that calculation is doing is very difficult. And so we just kind of trust that this works. And we can see that it works when we train it. But trying to understand the actual calculation going on inside is a little bit futile in general. Now this ReLU operator, and well, let me come back to that in a second. So we have a linear layer of the neural network. We have another one here where we just have some more weights that go from the 512 to the 512. And then we have another one here that goes from 512 to 10. Now, the reason there's 10 is because the way this network's going to work is it's not going to predict a number 0 through 9. It's going to predict, it's going to produce 10 signals. And we're going to look at those 10 signals. And if all of them except one of them is, sorry, if the first one is really high and the rest are really low, then we say, oh, it's predicting 0. And if the second one is really high and the rest are really low, we'll say it's predicting 1. And if the third one is really high and the rest are really low, we say it's predicting 2. And that just happens to be much, much easier to get a neural network to do than trying to get it to predict the number 9 or the number 4 or something. It's much easier to train all of these numbers to turn into a really high signal in one place and a really low signal everywhere else. The ReLU is just a weird little operator that helps neural networks a whole bunch. All that it does is it looks at the input. Any input that's less than 0, it sets to 0. That's the entire ReLU operator. And the reason I like with neural networks, I can't explain exactly why these work. But what I can say in terms of intuition is that the ReLU kind of offers the network an opportunity to have an if statement in the middle. It's kind of saying if the value you get is less than 0, we're going to set it to 0. That's like there's a consequence of having a certain value. And there's no consequence to having other values. And so it's sort of like a little something that kind of approximates a conditional inside of the neural network. That's about all I can tell you about why we use those, but they do tend to help these networks work. Okay, so really all this is it's basically a set of connections with weights between the inputs and the outputs. We go from a bunch of inputs to 10 outputs, and we have these kind of steps in the middle. Yeah, what's your question?
So, okay. 10 is set by the number of classes you're predicting.
Exactly.
8 is set by the image dimension.
Exactly, yeah.
Why is 512?
No reason. We could change that and see if it works better or worse. There isn't, for a lot of this kind of internals of the neural networks, there isn't really a science that says, here's how many internal parameters you should have. Instead, it's more of an engineering problem where, and you'll see this in the deep learning literature, is that people come up with these architectures for deep learning models, and they'll publish the architecture and they'll explain kind of in theory why it works better, but it's often comes down to some intuition about things. It's not necessarily something that we understand in a really deep kind of way. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a really good question. Why 512? I promise you it'll work if we do 1024 instead. It'll probably work if we do 256, but that's less kind of space for it to play around with internally.
But that number is just a little bit arbitrary.
It is extremely arbitrary. Yeah.
So I guess my question is like, if I was applying this to different problems, like, how do you build an intuition for like what goes in this?
Yeah.
Like, it seems like I could just add like 2 more lines that say like 512 to.
Absolutely.
You know, and like,
Yeah.
it just, like, how do you start to get a sense of what works best or what
Yeah.
everything, yeah.
That's a great question, and that's sort of a question that haunts me all the time. So there isn't, I can't give you a simple answer to that question. One thing that you have to consider is whether or not you have so many weights on the inside that it's going to take a really long time, but not give you much extra power, because you only really need 200 weights or whatever, and you've given yourself 2000. On the other hand, if you don't have enough weights, you may not have given your network enough flexibility to actually solve the problem. So it's something that you kind of have to experiment with a little bit. Beyond that, there are a lot of people in the AI space who are working on these all the time and are thinking about the kinds of problems that they solve. And so really going to the literature is a much better way than trying to develop your own. And there are a lot of really standard, really well working networks out there. So there's like the ResNet, which is really good at image classification, and just tends to work with a lot of kinds of inputs. There's like UNets, which is really good at image segmentation if you want to like pick out different pieces of an image or something like that. There are just a whole bunch of existing networks out there. And typically you don't even need to write this sequential function. PyTorch just will give you that, like, I'll need to check here, but I think there may even be a ResNet 18 or something. No, well, in PyTorch, there is a ResNet function that will just give you a ResNet back. I don't know where it is offhand. But like a lot of these models are already even pre-trained and you can just start using them. Yeah. Okay, so we're kind of at the end of the session. I can show you really quick what happens when we train this without going into too much detail. But if I just run this, we have a model. I declare an optimizer here, and then this is the, whoops, I skipped a step. There we go. So here we're actually just doing the optimization, and it's really just a loop that basically says, take one of the inputs and outputs, use the model to calculate a prediction, and then we have a loss function I defined up there that just turns that into an estimate of how bad the model did. And then calculate this basically says calculate the gradient and take a step. And the backward is because it's the backward gradient propagation function. And then this is just a print statement. But once we've done this, I've got a cell here that just prints out random sets of these and sees how well it did. And like here, it clearly understood this was a 7, but it got the rest of these wrong. So it didn't, I mean, we trained it for like no time at all. So it's not surprising that it's not doing very well. But I mean, I don't know. I think that's a pretty reasonable guess as a 7. That's clearly got the 3 right. So, you know, it's doing okay, but it's probably above chance, which is 1 in 10, but it's not probably above 50%. So you get the sense for how this works. Okay, so that was a lot really quickly. Thank you for being patient with it. I'd be happy to talk about this more if y'all are interested in doing projects that involve CNNs or deep learning. I do a lot of deep learning research, and in particular, I've done a lot of work on whether you can train a network to predict functional brain areas, that kind of stuff. So if this is a topic you're interested in, I'm around next week and happy to talk about it. But I think we can stop here. It's after 5. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, no problem. And yeah, have a good weekend. We'll see you on Monday.